In the summer of 1945, the unthinkable happened. The voice that had never before been heard by common people echoed through crackling radios across Japan, the emperor himself admitting defeat. For the first time in their history, the Japanese people heard their living God speak of surrender. But what terrified them most wasn't the defeat itself. It was what they believed would come next. The propaganda had been relentless, painting Allied soldiers as monsters who would seek brutal revenge. Japanese women, in particular, had been told to fear the worst, that foreign troops would destroy, violate, and leave nothing but ashes. So when the first British soldiers set foot on Japanese soil, when women saw those tall figures in unfamiliar uniforms walking through their devastated streets, they trembled, they hid, they prepared for the end. But what actually happened in those first encounters between British soldiers and Japanese civilians wasn't what anyone expected. It was something far more complex, far more human, and far more profound than either side could have imagined. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and what you know about this forgotten chapter of history. This isn't just another war story. This is about the moment when two peoples, torn apart by years of brutal conflict, came face to face in the most vulnerable circumstances imaginable. It's about how fear can be transformed into understanding, how enemies can rediscover their shared humanity, and how even in the darkest aftermath of war, seeds of compassion can take root. What unfolded in those days following Japan's surrender would challenge every assumption, break down walls of hatred, and reveal truths about human nature that both sides desperately needed to remember. This is a story that history often overlooks, but one that holds lessons more relevant today than ever before. August 15th, 1945. The date is burned into Japanese memory. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and formal, delivered words that shattered an empire's identity. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Surrender. The word itself had been unthinkable. For years, Japanese civilians had been taught that death was preferable to the shame of defeat. Mothers had been instructed to kill their children rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to paint Allied soldiers, particularly British and American troops, as inhuman savages who would show no mercy. Women were told explicitly that foreign soldiers would assault them, that their honor and their lives would be forfeit. Entire communities prepared for mass suicide. In some areas, women practiced with sharpened bamboo spears, ready to defend themselves to the death, or take their own lives before capture. The terror was real, visceral, all-consuming. When British forces began arriving in areas of Japanese-controlled territory, and eventually Japan itself, they came as part of the Allied occupation. These weren't fresh-faced recruits. These were men who had survived some of the most brutal combat of the entire war. Many had endured years in the hellish jungles of Burma, fighting against a Japanese military that had shown little mercy. Others had been prisoners of war themselves, held in camps where starvation, disease, and systematic cruelty had been daily realities. They had witnessed atrocities. They had lost brothers in arms. They had every reason by the logic of war to hate. And yet, when these battle-hardened British soldiers entered Japanese towns and cities, they carried with them orders that would prove transformative. The British command had made a strategic and moral decision. Occupation would be conducted with discipline, restraint, and respect for civilian life. The soldiers themselves, despite their experiences, despite their losses, were about to discover something unexpected in the faces of those who trembled before them. In a small coastal town, where buildings still stood but bore the scars of air raids, a British unit arrived on a humid morning. The streets were eerily silent. Doors and windows were shuttered. The soldiers could feel eyes watching from behind wooden slats and torn paper screens. Their commanding officer, a Lieutenant Colonel named James Pemberton, was a man who carried the war's weight in his eyes, but also something else, a deep, almost spiritual conviction about the dignity inherent in every human being. Pemberton had been a teacher before the war, a man who had read philosophy and poetry, who had once believed that education could transform the world. The war had tested that belief brutally. He had seen men die in agony, had held friends as they took their last breaths. He had been a prisoner for 8 months, surviving on rice gruel and the strength of his will. And yet, standing in that silent Japanese street, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. "We will not enter homes without permission," he told his men, his voice quiet but firm. "We will offer help, not take. We will show them that we are not what they fear. Some of his soldiers looked at him with confusion, even resentment. These were the enemy after all. These were the people whose army had committed unspeakable acts. But Pemberton's authority wasn't the kind that came from rank alone. It came from something deeper, from a moral clarity that his men had learned to trust even when they didn't fully understand it. So they followed his lead, knocking gently on doors, speaking in halting Japanese learned from phrasebooks, offering food and medical supplies instead of demands. The first woman who opened her door did so with hands trembling so violently she could barely turn the handle. Her name was Fumiko, a widow whose husband had died in the past, fighting in the Pacific. She had 3 young children hiding behind her, their faces pale with terror. When she saw the British soldiers standing there, tall, foreign, with rifles slung over their shoulders, she nearly collapsed. Every warning, every nightmare scenario flooded her mind. This was the moment she had been taught to fear above all others. But then something happened that shattered her expectations completely. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton removed his cap, bowed slightly in the Japanese manner, and spoke in broken but respectful Japanese. "We bring no harm. We bring food. Children hungry?" His accent was terrible, his grammar was worse. But the gesture, the tone, the look in his eyes, Fumiko had not expected kindness. She had not expected to see anything human in these foreign faces. Her children, hungry for days, peered out from behind her skirt. Pemberton reached into his pack slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible and non-threatening. He pulled out chocolate bars, condensed milk, and biscuits. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less intimidating, and held them out. The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 4, looked up at his mother with desperate hope. Fumiko's mind raced. Was this a trick? Would accepting these offerings lead to something darker? But the hunger in her children's eyes overrode her fear. She nodded, barely perceptible, and her son rushed forward and grabbed the chocolate. The British soldiers smiled. Not the cruel smiles she had been warned about, but genuine expressions of relief, of connection. One soldier, a young private named Thomas who had younger siblings back in Yorkshire, crouched down and made a funny face at the children. Despite everything, despite the fear and the years of propaganda, the little boy laughed. That sound, a child's laughter in the ruins of war, broke something open in that moment. Fumiko began to cry, not from fear anymore but from the overwhelming shock of experiencing mercy when she had expected only horror. Through her tears she bowed deeply, repeatedly, her body language speaking what her voice couldn't. Pemberton bowed back, and in that exchange something profound occurred. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't forgetting, but it was recognition. It was 2 human beings, from opposite sides of a terrible conflict, acknowledging each other's humanity for the first time. Word spread through the town like wildfire. The British soldiers were not what they had been told to expect. More doors began to open, cautiously at first. Women emerged from hiding places, from cellars and attics where they had barricaded themselves with their children. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. Initial terror, trembling hands, eyes wide with fear, followed by the slow realization that these foreign soldiers were offering help, not violence. The British distributed food and medical supplies, helped repair wells damaged in the fighting, and even shared cigarettes with the few men who hadn't fled or died in the war. But the transformation wasn't one-sided. The British soldiers, many of whom had harbored deep resentment and anger toward the Japanese, found themselves confronting something unexpected. The sight of genuine suffering among civilians who had been as much victims of their own government's propaganda and militarism as anyone else. Private Thomas, who had initially struggled with his orders to show compassion, found himself sitting in the ruins of a home, sharing tea with an elderly Japanese woman who reminded him painfully of his own grandmother. She showed him photographs of her sons, both killed in the war. Through gestures and a few translated words from a local who spoke broken English, she told him that she had never wanted the war, that she had prayed for it to end, that she had lost everything. Thomas, whose best friend had died in Burma at the hands of Japanese soldiers, felt his carefully maintained anger begin to crack. This woman wasn't his enemy. She was just someone who had suffered, just as he had, just as everyone had. But not everyone was ready for reconciliation. In the town there were men who had survived the war, former soldiers and fervent nationalists who viewed cooperation with the occupiers as the ultimate betrayal. One such man was Kenji Watanabe, a former Imperial Army captain who had returned home to find his world destroyed. Watanabe was a complicated figure, a man who had believed absolutely in his nation's divine mission, who had fought with conviction, and who now found himself adrift in a reality that made no sense. When he saw Japanese women accepting food from British soldiers, when he saw children playing with the enemy, something inside him snapped. To him, this wasn't mercy. It was humiliation. It was contamination. It was the final defeat, not just military but spiritual and cultural. Watanabe began confronting women who interacted with the British. He would appear suddenly, his face twisted with anger and shame, and berate them in harsh tones. "Have you forgotten our honor? Have you forgotten what they did to our soldiers? You smile at them while our brothers' bones lie scattered across the Pacific." His words were venomous, designed to inflict maximum shame in a culture where social judgment carried tremendous weight. Some women withdrew back into their homes, terrified now not just of the foreign soldiers, but of their own countrymen's judgment. The fragile bridge of trust that was being built suddenly faced a new threat, not from the occupiers, but from those who could not accept the new reality. The tension peaked one afternoon in the town's central square, where British soldiers had set up a distribution point for food and medicine. Fumiko was there with her children, waiting in line, when Watanabe appeared with a group of like-minded men. They were loud, aggressive, positioning themselves between the civilians and the British soldiers. "These are our enemies," Watanabe shouted, his voice carrying across the square. "They bombed our cities. They killed our people. And now you accept their charity like beggars? Where is your pride? Where is your Japanese spirit?" The crowd fell silent. The British soldiers, sensing danger, put hands on their weapons but didn't draw them. Pemberton stepped forward, his posture calm but alert. The moment was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one aggressive gesture, and violence could erupt. But Pemberton did something that no one expected. He didn't confront Watanabe with force or authority. Instead, he addressed him directly in English, knowing that a translator nearby would convey his words. "You are angry. You have every right to be angry. You lost your nation's independence. You lost comrades. You lost honor as you understand it." The translator spoke, and Watanabe's eyes narrowed, suspicious of where this was going. Pemberton continued, his voice steady, almost gentle. "I too lost comrades. I too suffered. I was a prisoner of your army. I was starved, beaten, watched men die from disease and cruelty." The silence in the square was absolute now. Even Watanabe seemed taken aback. "But I learned something in that darkness," Pemberton went on, and now his voice carried a weight that commanded attention. "I learned that hatred is easy. Revenge is easy. What is difficult, what requires true strength, is to break the cycle, to choose a different path." Watanabe's face flushed with fury. "You speak of strength? You stand in my country as conquerors and lecture me about strength?" His voice cracked with emotion. "You don't understand what you've taken from us." And here Pemberton made a choice that would define everything that followed. He unbuttoned his shirt collar and pulled it aside, revealing deep scars on his shoulder and neck. "These are from bamboo canes, from guards at the camp where I was held. For 8 months I was treated as less than human." The crowd gasped. Even Watanabe fell silent. "I could hate. Every day I could choose to hate. But I have seen where hate leads. I have seen what it does to the hater and the hated. So I choose something different. Not because I am weak, but because I refuse to let the war continue in my heart." The words, translated carefully, hung in the air. Pemberton took a step closer to Watanabe, his eyes meeting the former captain's with an intensity that was neither threatening nor submissive. It was something else. Entirely. It was an invitation. "You speak of honor. I respect honor. But is there honor in allowing children to starve because of pride? Is there honor in continuing to fight a war that has already ended? Or is true honor found in protecting your people, even if it means accepting help from those you once called enemies?" The square was so silent you could hear the wind moving through the damaged buildings. Watanabe's hands were shaking now, but not with anger, with something more complex. His world of absolutes, of clear lines between right and wrong, enemy and ally, honor and shame, was crumbling. Then Pemberton did something that shocked everyone present. He bowed. Not a slight nod, but a deep formal bow of genuine respect. "I honor your service to your country. I honor your suffering. And I ask you, help us help your people. You know them better than we ever could. You know what they need. Work with us, not for us. Be the leader they need now. In peace, as you were in war. It was an offer that acknowledged Watanabe's dignity, his experience, his value, everything that defeat had stripped away. For a long moment Watanabe stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Years of military indoctrination told him to reject this, to see it as manipulation. But something in Pemberton's eyes, something in the sincerity of that bow, penetrated his defenses. His shoulders began to shake, and to the shock of everyone watching, tears began streaming down his face. The proud, former captain who had held himself together through defeat and humiliation, broke down in public, not from weakness but from the weight of finally being seen as a human being rather than just an enemy. What happened next would become legendary in that small town and would ripple outward. Watanabe slowly, hesitantly, returned the bow. It was jerky, uncertain, as if his body was fighting against his mind's command. But he did it. And in that gesture something shifted. The men who had come with him, ready to fight, to resist, stood confused. Their leader was bowing to the enemy. But as they watched Pemberton reach out and gently clasp Watanabe's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity, as they saw the British soldiers lower their weapons entirely, they began to understand that this wasn't surrender. This was something entirely different. This was the first step toward healing. In the days that followed, Watanabe became an unexpected bridge between the British forces and the Japanese community. He helped organize distribution efforts, translated not just words but cultural context, and slowly, painfully, began to construct a new sense of purpose from the ruins of his old identity. He would later say that Pemberton had given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to live with dignity. But the story doesn't end there, because the most profound revelation was still to come. As trust grew and the British established a more permanent presence, Pemberton organized what he called shared evenings, gatherings where British soldiers and Japanese civilians could interact in a non-transactional way, simply as people. Music was played, stories were shared through halting translation, and slowly the walls continued to come down. It was at one of these gatherings that Fumiko, the widow who had first opened her door, approached Pemberton with something in her hands. It was a letter, yellowed with age, written in English. Through a translator she explained that it had been written by a British prisoner of war who had been held near her town. He had somehow passed it to a kind Japanese guard, asking that it be delivered to his family in England if anything happened to him. The guard, conflicted and afraid, had given it to Fumiko's husband before he left for the Pacific, asking him to keep it safe. Her husband had died before he could do anything with it, and she had kept it hidden, not knowing what to do with it. The letter was addressed to a Mrs. Margaret Pemberton in Somerset, England. The room went completely still. Pemberton's hands trembled as he took the letter. It was from his older brother David, who had been reported missing in action 3 years earlier. The British officer who had maintained such extraordinary composure through everything fell to his knees. Fumiko, not understanding the full significance but sensing the emotion, knelt beside him. Through tears, Pemberton read his brother's last words, words of love for his family, of hope that the war would end, of surprising compassion for his captors who he noted were also suffering. The letter ended with a sentence that struck everyone present like lightning. Tell James that if he survives this war, he must not let hatred win. Tell him to build bridges, not walls. That's the only way this madness ever ends. The coincidence, if it could be called that, seemed almost too profound to be real. Pemberton looked up at Fumiko, at Watanabe, at the gathered crowd of former enemies, and saw in their faces the reflection of his brother's final wish. He had been living out David's last instruction without even knowing it. The revelation broke something open in everyone present. Japanese civilians who had maintained emotional distance, protecting themselves from further pain, began openly weeping. British soldiers who had remained skeptical of the entire reconciliation process found themselves embracing Japanese families. The walls that war had built, that propaganda had reinforced, that fear and hatred had maintained, came crashing down. Watanabe approached Pemberton and, in halting English he had been secretly studying, said, "Your brother, wise man. You, wise man, I learn from you." It was a simple statement, grammatically broken, but it carried the weight of a complete transformation. The man who had been ready to fight to maintain his hatred had found something worth more than pride. He had found purpose in peace. In the weeks and months that followed, that small coastal town became a model for how occupation could be conducted with humanity. Other British units, hearing of Pemberton's approach, began implementing similar strategies. Japanese communities, seeing that the foreign soldiers were not the monsters they'd been warned about, began to engage more openly. Women who had trembled in fear now worked alongside British medics in makeshift hospitals. Former soldiers like Watanabe helped rebuild infrastructure, working side by side with their former enemies. The transformation wasn't universal or perfect. There were still incidents, still tensions, still deep wells of pain that couldn't be easily crossed. But in that one town, a seed had been planted. It was the seed of a radical idea, that even after the most terrible conflicts, even when both sides have committed and suffered atrocities, it is possible to choose a different path. It is possible to see the humanity in the other. It is possible to break the cycle of hatred. Years later, when historians would study the Allied occupation of Japan, they would note that areas where British forces followed Pemberton's approach had significantly smoother transitions, less resistance, and faster recovery. But the numbers and statistics miss the real story. The real story is in the faces of women who learned that their enemies could show mercy. It's in the tears of a former soldier who discovered that his dignity didn't depend on maintaining hatred. It's in the courage of men like Pemberton, who chose to honor his brother's wisdom rather than his own pain. Fumiko would later say, through a translator in an interview decades later, that the moment she saw those British soldiers offer chocolate to her children was the moment she understood that the war had truly ended. Not because of surrender documents or emperor's speeches, but because compassion had proven stronger than propaganda. Watanabe, who lived into his 80s, would become a local advocate for peace education, always carrying with him a photograph of himself and Pemberton standing together, former enemies united by a shared commitment to something greater than their conflict. And Pemberton? He would return to teaching after the war. But he would never forget those days in that small Japanese town. He would tell his students that the greatest lesson the war taught him wasn't about strategy or courage in battle. It was about the extraordinary strength required to extend grace to those who have hurt you, to see past hatred to the human being underneath. The story of Japanese women who trembled when they met British soldiers isn't ultimately a story about fear. It's a story about what happens when fear is met with unexpected kindness, when hatred is confronted with grace, when the cycle of revenge is deliberately, courageously broken. It's a reminder that in every conflict, there comes a moment when we must choose. Do we perpetuate the violence, the judgment, the dehumanization? Or do we risk something far more dangerous and difficult? Do we risk compassion? The women who trembled discovered that their enemies were capable of mercy. The soldiers who came seeking order discovered that the defeated were capable of dignity. And everyone involved learned that transformation is possible, even in the darkest aftermath of war, when someone has the courage to take the first step. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about human nature and what's possible even in the worst circumstances, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this that remind us of our capacity for good even in darkness. Drop a comment below about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or when you chose compassion over judgment. Let's keep this conversation going, because these lessons aren't just about history, they're about how we choose to treat each other today, right now, in our own conflicts and divisions. The question Pemberton asked Watanabe is the question we all face. Will we let hatred win, or will we build bridges? Your answer matters. Our collective answer changes the world.